Hello, hi, my name is Sorrel Pindar. I'm a mental wealth coach and I'm the host of the Post-Traumatic Growth Summit. The presentations in this series were all recorded at the Post-Traumatic Growth Summit in November 2022. And now before you watch the other videos in this series, I want to give you a brief overview of the history of post-traumatic growth, or the concept, I should say, history of the concept, and a little bit about my own experience of post-traumatic growth and my interest in it. So the concept of post-traumatic growth has a more than 25-year history. So it's not a new concept. The expression was first coined by two researchers in the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, two psychology researchers. Their names were Tedeschi and Calhoun. And they had their first publication in 1996 after having done a few years of research. Now, their initial research went against the grain of psychology research at that time, in that they used open-ended interviews in which they listened to their respondents. And having done psychology research back in the 80s, I know how rare that would have been. So their first study was of widows, older women who had been recently bereaved. And they expected them to have experienced a degree of trauma by that bereavement. They were curious. They knew they were not experts. They knew they had a lot to learn. And like I said, they listened. They asked open-ended questions and they listened. And what they discovered was that those women experienced more growth than trauma. Now, the other thing that went against the grain of research at that time in psychology was that they were focusing on how people healed rather than finding a dysfunction to fix. And so they really were interested in post-traumatic growth. And in the end, they did develop a measure, an inventory, the post-traumatic growth inventory, which meant that other people could conduct research into the same area and have comparable results, which is always something we want in psychology. It makes your findings a bit more credible if everybody else has similar findings to you. And research into post-traumatic growth has spread around the world, from Japan to Australia to Turkey to the US to the UK and the rest of Europe. And the overall findings have been that more than 50% of trauma survivors experience post-traumatic growth, and only about 8 to 10% of trauma survivors experience PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, if you don't already know. So that finding is a testament to the innate healing power of the human being, which is exactly what we focused on in the summit. So what do we mean by post-traumatic growth? What does it include? Well, it includes sometimes the learning of new skills, like those widows. They had to learn to do things their husbands had had always done until they died. But it can include a new sense of purpose, a deepening of relationships with others and with oneself and with one's community, maybe spiritual awakening, or a new understanding of what it means to be human. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience. I had two big traumas in my life. The first was being sent to boarding school when I was 11 years old. And the second was the suicide of my first boyfriend, Andy, when I was 20. I lived with depression for nearly 40 years. And I did get some relief from counselling and psychotherapy. But I have to say, the focus on re-examining the past over and over again, looking for meaning, for instance, trying to understand it, that was counterproductive, because it ends up reinforcing all the neural pathways that lead to the pain. But all of that changed when I started coach training. Now, I did the lion's share of my coach training with Jamie Smart, who is our first contributor. And I've benefited enormously from the insights I've had since I've known him. But I want to tell you a story about the biggest insight of all, which is a real turning point for me. And it occurred in the late spring of 2020. Jamie had been speaking about the notion of emotional baggage during a training weekend. You know, the idea that we often have of carrying around a rucksack full of anger or guilt or despair, and that maybe we could put it down and have a rest, or perhaps unload some of those emotions and leave them behind. But Jamie pointed out that this is just a metaphor. There is no rucksack, and there is no carrying emotions around either. We create them afresh every time we experience them. Of course, if you've been creating the experience of depression or the experience of guilt for the last 40 years, you'll be very good at it because you've had a lot of practice. But you're not carrying it around. But it made sense intellectually, but it didn't really land for me straight away. I didn't get an embodied sense of what that meant. But a few days later, I was walking around the park. I did a lot of that in those days. It was lockdown. And I spent a lot of time walking around the park reflecting. And on that day, I thought about the guilt that I believed I was carrying around in that metaphorical rucksack, and had been for the previous 42 years since Andy took his life. And in that moment, I realized that I had been believing that I was sort of dipping into a well of guilt, like with a ladle. Every time I experienced it, I got a ladle full of guilt out. And I thought, no, I'm not. There is no well, there's no ladle, and I'm creating it every time I feel it. And in that moment, I didn't feel it anymore. It just vanished like a puff of smoke. And I hadn't actually felt it since. And the really weird thing is I can't even remember what it felt like, which is huge. So that was a powerful change in my life. And it wasn't the beginning or the end of my post-traumatic growth, but it was a big part of it. For me, post-traumatic growth has been about a number of things. Firstly, probably the very first thing, which will go back to 2016 actually, was realizing that I am not a victim. I can cast myself as a victim, but I am not actually a victim, and I cannot be a victim for somebody else or circumstances. Secondly, recognizing that being always focused on my past, as I used to be, is counterproductive and serves to make me feel worse. So now I know if I start ruminating about the past, I stop myself because it's not going to help. And then understanding that the trauma I experienced is actually a gift, as it has brought me to a much more profound understanding of who I am, what my purpose is, why the heck I am here on this planet. And then an increased awareness of the wisdom of my body, which is a sure guide to when I am not in alignment with myself. So there are 6 presentations in this collection. All of our contributors are coaches and 2 of them are doctors. First was Jamie Smart, who is our keynote speaker. He's an internationally acclaimed speaker, coach and consultant, and a Sunday Times bestselling author. Then came Dr. Rani Bora, who is a holistic psychiatrist, a coach, and a specialist in de-prescribing psychiatric medication. She was followed by Julie Finn, who talks about how trauma strikes twice, rarely just the one time. And she does embodiment coaching. So she takes the embodied approach to the whole post-traumatic growth. And she has had a very interesting embodiment practice during her talk. Towards the end, I recommend you have a look at that. I am not giving it away. She was followed by Wayne Fletcher, who's a specialist in men's mental health, and took a focus on listening as a vaccine. Then Sam Golding, who is an addiction specialist, and his focus is on sobriety as an act of rebellion, that actually to not drink is the act of rebellion rather than drinking. Kind of turns things on its head, doesn't it? And finally, our final speaker was the glitter practitioner, Dr. Nupi Aurora. Nupi is a holistic GP as well as a coach. She has a domestic background in domestic violence. And she introduced her F list, which is basically a guide to looking after yourself, both your physical health and your mental health. And I will leave her to go through her F list, but watch that video because actually she's a scream. You'll enjoy it. And I urge you, as you watch these videos, to just listen to yourself as well as listening to the speakers. And pay attention to what's happening in your body, because there may be moments when something arises that causes your body to react in a particular way. And it may be interesting to notice what's going on and ask yourself, what is this telling me? So welcome to the summit, or to the recordings of the summit. and enjoy, because there's a lot of fun in there, as well as the serious stuff.